Hello and welcome to the Wildcard Rewind. I'm sure you're shocked at hearing my voice because it's been quite a few weeks, but yes, I am back. Thankfully, it's just the best two this week. No Paul, he's off doing who knows what. So it's Lewis and I only. And we've got a cracking show for you. You know, we had UKFFC this week, which included the Scott Fish Bowl live draft. So I think it was only right that we talk everything Scott Fish Bowl. So let's get straight to it.
I just wanna rewind to when we were young at heart. Back to all those good times. Take me back to the start.
Lewis, how are you? I've seen you for the first time ever in real life, which was awesome. So we had a great start to the weekend, but I don't think, we can kind of mention the weekend without mentioning last night, which unfortunately was a sad end to the weekend with England losing in the Euros final. But how are you recovering, Lewis? How are you feeling after that bad loss?
Yeah, it was an incredible weekend, and it just had the potential to be maybe the best weekend of my life. Like the Scott Fish Bowl live draft on Friday night was fantastic. It was the first time I've been in a live draft. It was the first UK FFC that I managed to get to. So getting to meet so many familiar faces that you and I have probably spent 100 hours on calls together, but never actually been in the same room before. So getting to actually meet you and give you a hug was great. And then it just had the potential to be the greatest weekend ever. But it wasn't to be, and that was fine. I was telling you beforehand, I had a very miserable train journey back from Essex with a bunch of people in England shirts, looking very somber the whole way home. But it hasn't dampened my enthusiasm from how much fun I had on Friday and Saturday.
Yeah, that was great. And obviously, like you say, we had the live drafts on Friday and I thought they were lots and lots of fun. I'm currently actually in a slow draft, so I didn't live draft with you guys, but it was great to watch people drafting, kind of making their picks, regretting it at the time. Lots of kind of excitement, jibing, having fun really, and some very, I would say, erroneous picks going on throughout the draft, which was, again, good fun to kind of see. So before we kind of dig into it a little bit more, because I'd love to hear a bit more about your team, Lewis, and how you found the experience and what kind of advice you've got for people that are going to be doing live drafts. We did have a little bit of news. Was it yesterday that Jordan Addison had been arrested for a DUI? Any concerns, any thoughts here, Lewis? Are you bothered?
I'm hugely bothered from a personal perspective. So this is actually the second time that Jordan Addison has had something like this, and the first one was last season. And this is a consistent issue in the NFL is drunk driving. We obviously saw one of the biggest tragedies being Henry Ruggs last season. Or a couple of seasons ago, not a tragedy for Henry Ruggs, but a tragedy for the woman that he killed. We also then saw a rookie cornerback from the Vikings, Kyrie Jackson, was killed by a drunk driver just after a week ago. So that's not just a player in the NFL being killed by this. It's a player on Jordan Addison's team was killed by a drunk driver last week, and now he's gone out and done this. I think it's the stupidest thing that you can do. I think there's so many other things that happen in the NFL where there's huge amounts of concussion issues. There's a lot of mental health issues. There's lots of problems that come from people coming from troubled backgrounds and the way that might affect them as they then mature into young men, and also you see a lot of the time that people struggle with coming from a slightly disadvantaged background and then suddenly earning a lot of money and not really being prepared to cope with that. There's a lot of issues that take place in the NFL that I can really understand why they happen. When you get, was it the Titans first round draft pick a couple of seasons ago that really went off the rails, like jumping out of windows and being seen like shirtless and drunk on the street? Like, I can understand if you suddenly give a kid this outrageous amount of money, it's going to affect you, and some people aren't built to handle it. Drunk driving is really the one thing in the NFL that I just can't understand. The NFLPA offers a basically a ride scheme. So they have someone that's on hand that they can message when they need a lift home, that will send a taxi out to them. You can get an Uber from anywhere. Like they have enough money that this should not be a problem. So for someone to be this idiotic, and drive himself home drunk, look, it's fortunate that nothing particularly bad happened off the back of it. But if it was up to me, I'd see him suspended for the whole season. He won't be, and that brings us on to the fantasy impact. It depends really in terms of the fantasy impact as to whether or not this is seen as a second offence. So obviously, last time he wasn't actually punished for it. There actually wasn't anything that happened off the back of it. It depends as to whether or not this DUI is seen now as this is the second offence, and so he's going to get suspended. I wouldn't be surprised to see a 3 or 4 game suspension, or maybe 2 or 3, just because of what happened so recently and wanting to make an example of Addison. It wouldn't really affect me in terms of drafting him, and obviously, what's it going to do? Boost Justin Jefferson from the 105 to the 104? Like, that doesn't make a huge amount of difference. There's not a huge amount of fantasy impact. What it will do is it will make me hesitant to draft him, because I only really tend to draft players that I want to root for them to do well. So yeah, there's a big long ramble, less about the fantasy impact and more just about the idiocy of a man who chooses to do this.
No, I think it was a really great summary, and I agree. I think it really is a stupid thing for them to do. They've got the money, they can afford a taxi or, some other way home, and they choose not to do that, having heard of the impacts, of this throughout the NFL and throughout general life. So, I totally agree with you, Lewis. And, we should be bothered, that these things still happen, and these players are, role models for a lot of young, children, people, so I think, they're setting a bad example by behaving this way. And I think it's really unfortunate that it's been now kind of 2 off seasons in a row that he's doing it. Clearly he's not kind of learning his lesson. And I think that's kind of red flags for, what other behaviours we may see that may ultimately kind of derail his NFL career in the longer term. It'd be interesting to kind of see how things progress and whether we will get any repercussions or not. I suspect they might not, but I think we have to just kind of see how things go through. I was kind of a little bit less on him anyway, kind of this season. He did, pretty well. When he had touchdowns, he had good spike weeks, but he was otherwise relatively average. Obviously, the quarterback is now changing. We know Justin Jefferson is the proper number 1 there. Obviously, Hockenson will be out at the beginning, so he'd probably get more volume, initially. But once Hockenson is back, I think that's kind of reduce a bit. So, again, I agree. I'm probably a bit hesitant to kind of draft him now, really, based on that.
He actually very quietly had a very good season last season. So he finished as the wide receiver 23. I believe he finished as the second highest rookie wide receiver. I think he was just ahead of Jaden Reed and Rashee Rice, obviously well behind Puka. So definitely there was a lot of upside for him for this season. The difficulty being that it'll be Sam Darnold, then JJ McCarthy. And Sam Darnold doesn't, support any fancy relevance, and rookie quarterbacks they struggle to maintain 1 top 12 option, but they definitely won't sustain 2 top 12 options, which is definitely something worth considering when it comes to the Bears this season. But I don't think the path was there for Addison to have a particularly fancy relevant season anyway. But this probably, if there is a suspension, even if it potentially comes from the team, not from the NFL, obviously makes that even less likely.
Yeah, obviously, Jefferson was out for a bit of that season last year, and I do think there were some weeks where he wasn't that great. But no, I agree. He certainly did have quite a few weeks where he was quietly useful. But still, I'm not sure. Maybe I'm going to be wrong about this. So anyway, let's move on and chat about Scott Fish Bowl. So
Yeah.
obviously you were in the London live drafts on Friday. So how did you find the experience, Lewis? Was it an enjoyable one? Are you glad you did a live draft, or would you have your time again, potentially do slow? And what kind of takeaways do you have for people that might be doing live drafts, either Scottish Bowl over the next few weeks or others, home leagues, redraft, whatever, later this summer?
So, in terms of my experience generally, I absolutely loved it. And I think Scott Fishbowl is something a little bit unique and a little bit special. So, everyone is just very delighted to be in the room, which makes a huge difference to the atmosphere, because everyone is definitely much more nervous because it's a really big competition, but just so excited to be able to be there. My league mates, the people in my division, were all absolutely fantastic. There were a bunch of people that I knew, but also quite a few that I don't. It was really nice to be able to meet some new people as well and get chatting to them. And then obviously as the night progresses a little bit, start shouting at them about their picks as well and screaming when you get sniped on someone. There was in our division a very big sniping on Jared Goff from to be taken from Rich Cooling. In the fifth when he had Amon Ra in the first. So like there was a big disappointment there, or maybe Amon Ra in the second. But yeah, there was a big disappointment there. It's definitely a very different experience. You can kind of chuck everything when it comes to ADP out the window. And that even comes to then like being able to remember yourself what your strategy is. When you're drafting on sleeper, and I've played a lot of DraftKings this off season, so like I'm really getting to. I've got quite a good feel of the way that drafts tend to take shape and knowing the players that normally they actually tend to go well above their ADP, the players that normally slip quite a way beyond. So, like Joe Burrow, for example, always tends to slip beyond his ADP. Someone like Sam Laporta, like you can never really tell where he's going to go. I've seen him go at the back of the first before. Like he's someone that people are quite happy to reach on a little bit. When it comes to a live draft, there's just no patterns to follow. You can definitely see examples of people sort of getting bullied down a certain path or people getting influenced down a certain path by the other people around them. Like you definitely saw some quite big positional runs by people panicking. We've only got, a minute to 2 minutes to put this pick in, or in our league, especially until we start shouting at you to make the pick, to put your pick in. And people going, well, 3 quarterbacks are just gone in front of me and I need a quarterback, so I guess I'm going to have to take one here. And I was suspect of it myself. There was in the 7th, I was probably looking at getting an extra running back or getting a tight end too. And then the quarterbacks just started flying off in front of me. And in the end, I took Baker Mayfield as my QB2, which was fine because it stuck with Mike Evans. But I was really planning in my head and settling, I'm going to push. I'm going to see if I can get him to the 3rd. We'll see if we can last it to there. And then they just went, and I was like, I just need to do this. I just need to get it in now just to make sure that I've got that quarterback 2 spot ready. So yeah, it was an incredibly enjoyable experience. I would definitely do it again. I definitely will do it again if I can. In terms of like for anyone else going into live drafts and things I'd recommend. So first of all, like would definitely recommend doing it for at least one draft, whether it's you can get to on the live draft for Scott Fishbowl. They're absolutely fantastic. The community is amazing. Whether you're a listener in the UK that was considering whether or not to come to UK FFC, like it's a great way to get in the room and you will make friends immediately and also make some enemies immediately if you take players in front of them. So I would definitely recommend that. But even if it's just a case of, your home league that you've been playing in with your best mates for 10 years, it's such a different experience all getting in the room, and you can get draft boards really easily with stickers to be able to do it not on sleeper. It just changes the way you have to draft entirely. So for me, obviously without sleeper in front of me and with the context that we're playing in the basement of a bar where the signal's not fantastic, so I had loads of notes printed out in front of me. I had a tracker for my team. I had the value over replacement level player table. I had the live draft ADP. I had the slow draft ADP. I created a stack chart which was sorted by team and then by ADP as well. So to go, right, if I end up with Anthony Richardson at the 105, where do I need to take Michael Pittman to go with him? And also, I planned out the first 5 rounds. Actually, the advice that I would take, having done that, is to not plan that much. Things go completely out the window immediately, and it reached a point where I actually felt I was drafting better by not staring at my notes. There were lots of people around me, and I'm sure a lot of people from the draft will be listening, and they're a huge bunch of nerds. So they're all there with like printed out data and lots of things that they're crossing off, and it means that you're not being so reactive to the draft in front of you. And the example that I'll give is definitely so. I think I was the second when at the time that I checked. Obviously, you can get the Scott Fishbowl ADP online, and I was the second latest Stefan Diggs drafter, and Diggs ADP is about the 605, and I got him at the 808. The latest was at the 810, and obviously people are so in their heads about, well, I've strategized that I'm going to go quarterback, wide receiver, running back, tight end, quarterback, and it means that you're not being so reactive to what's actually out there. And genuinely, I was, a couple of pints deep, and I was planning through my strategy, and then someone picked up the wide receiver sheet, and it was a guy in front of me, and I just saw that Stefan Diggs' name was still there, and I was like, people have just forgotten to draft Stefan Diggs, or like everyone in a row has gone, I'm not so sure about the new situation, And in the end, I end up getting him as my wide receiver 3, and that's a player who, in 1QB leagues in DraftKings, is going, back of the second, midway through the third. Like, I think definitely making sure that, yes, you do a lot of preparation, you have all the resources with you that you need to make sure that you can actually draft properly and you're not just going to get overwhelmed by the situation. But my biggest piece of advice is just to stay present in the room and make sure that you actually are seeing what's happening around you. Because sometimes you will just start to get players slipping that other people aren't really paying attention to because they're sort of too focused on their spreadsheets.
Yeah, that's absolutely right, isn't it? Like you say, I think sometimes people, they're so, being rigid with what they planned out before, I'm going to do X, Y, and Z, that they forget to think actually what is going on in the draft, and how can I alter my plan based on what others are doing. So I think that's a really great piece of advice. Obviously, I didn't draft live. I'm doing a slow draft now. I'm quite a meticulous drafter.
Yeah.
I take ages to make a decision, like literally ages.
You do, you're right.
And like live drafting, for me, I think it would just be a bit too stressful. Actually, I wouldn't mind doing a live draft, but not a Scott Fishbowl. I just feel, and again, I know it's just a bit of fun. It's for charity, and who cares? There's like 4,000 people in it. You ain't gonna win, but so go and have fun and draft.
Yeah.
But I'm like, it's an important draft. I need to think about it. So, it takes me ages to decide on my pick. I'm looking at ADP, I'm looking at other people's kind of opinions, and then I'm trying to kind of make my own. And I think that would be a bit overwhelming doing that in a live situation. However, I do wonder whether potentially that might be a bit freeing for me to, like, you haven't got time to do the thinking, just pick.
Yeah.
And I'd be very happy to kind of do that in a different draft, and maybe one year I should just give it a go, be brave and give it a go.
I actually think it's the perfect competition to do it in, because if you're doing it in a money league and there's something really on the line, completely I can understand like why you then end up being so meticulous over each pick and wanting to get everything spot on. At the end of the day, none of us are going to win the Scott Fishbowl. Like, one person is going to, but it is the biggest charity competition in the world. It's so unlikely to win it. Obviously, that does make it more prestigious and you want to do well. But it almost then, I found, takes the pressure off that you're like, well, if I flame out, it's not going to matter because, first of all, I'm probably not going to finish as low as Paul did last year. And also, like, most people are going to flame out. Most people aren't going to make playoffs. Like, it's such a tough competition. Actually, I can just kind of relax into it a little bit. And that was what I was going to say as the other piece of advice for live drafting is, when you're throwing ADP out the window and when things are going in such a different way than you're used to, one of the most important things is just to end up leaving with a team that you're happy with. And I know that sounds like a very simple piece of advice, but actually I found sometimes that when I was looking and going, so I'm really into, and you'll have heard me mention about them before, Tony Pollard and Jaylen Warren this offseason. And when it got to the ninth round and the ADPs were a bit lower and the cheat sheets that I was looking at didn't have them as, the most valuable players there, it was recommending elsewhere. And, they aren't returners. So there was a little bit of like tetchiness within the scoring as to whether or not I should be considering them. But I was like, do you know what? If they both come back to me, Tony Pollard did, Jalen Warren did on the way back, I'm like, they're two players that I like a lot. And I'm going to just be happier if I end up leaving with the players that I like than ending up pushing and going, oh, well, the analytics or this person's opinion has started to show me that maybe it should be this, or I'm feeling forced into this because everyone else is taking two tight ends early. So should I be taking two tight ends early? Well, actually, you're going to feel so much happier if you just leave with a team that you would have been happy with in advance. And if that means kind of ignoring ADP midway through, I don't really see the issue with it. I think it's actually the time to sort of try and de-stress yourself by making moves that are just going to make you happy.
Yeah, and I think ultimately, ADP is just where other people have drafted them, right? It's not the Bible. You have to draft them here. And actually, it's just the average, so half the people will have drafted him earlier than that and half the people will have drafted him later. So, it's not like, oh, you cannot draft him before round 11. It's just the way other people have felt that his value is. But if you think his value is higher and you believe that he's going to be, well outperform what his current ADP is, why not take him earlier? I don't think there's any reason not to do that. And I think sometimes people get married to ADPs. I can't possibly take him earlier because the ADP says that he's not as good as these other running backs that go ahead of him. But if you don't believe that, then why should you? Yes, in some cases that might mean you feel you get extra value by taking him a bit later. But if you think actually he's not going to come back to me, then why not take him slightly earlier?
Yeah. And at the end of the day, in a live draft, you don't have trade. So you can't do the whole, I think it's going to be there in a few spots. I'll move back a bit and I'll play the board. No, if you think the player's not going to come back to you and you would be happier leaving with them, just take them.
Yeah, and so obviously we meant, well, you kind of touched a little bit on this while you were talking about live drafting, and that's obviously the returning points. So obviously the scoring this year is quite wacky in kind of a special teams way. So obviously 1 point for 5 yards of a kick or punt return, which is a lot, and then 10 points for any punt or kickoff return touchdown. And ultimately, we have been seeing a lot of these potential kick and punt returners going higher up the board than we would usually see. So what are your thoughts kind of on, because, I think that's probably the main kind of scoring or part of the scoring that is very different to previous years. So what are your thoughts on this and how has that impacted how you've been drafting, so far?
So the first thing I'll say is I think it's incredibly smart of Scott Fish and the Scott Fish Bowl team to make a point of doing this the season that the return rules change, to mean that none of us really have any idea what impact it's actually going to make. And it means that actually a change in the real NFL is making a difference to how we're playing fantasy. I think it's a very smart change to have made for the scoring. And I know they like to switch it up every year, but I think it's a really smart one for this year. In terms of my attitude towards it, so when you have a look, you've seen players like Rashid Shaheed, who, by the way, incredible that he's now the biggest trending player across fantasy football when he's been the player that we've been making jokes about being our sponsor for the last year.
It's like we knew, Lewis. It's like we knew.
We were ahead of the times. So he actually went at the back of the first in one draft, which is insane. Yeah. His highest drafted slot was 112. And he would have finished as a wide receiver 4 last year in this scoring. He's still not worth a first round pick, but you can see why people are doing it. My big thing with it is, and we had a big conversation about this Friday night, actually, we as analysts are bad at projecting roles for players in skill positions. We're very bad at figuring out who the running back 2 on a team is going to be. We're quite bad at figuring out, who's going to end up playing more in the slot or who's going to end up being the X on a certain team. We spend a lot of time trying to predict these things, and actually a lot of the time we don't end up getting it right. It is even harder to predict roles on special teams than it is with offensive snaps. And just because a player was a good returner last year doesn't mean they're going to be a good returner this year. Doesn't mean they're going to be a good returner with the new kickoff rules. Doesn't even mean they're going to be the returner this year. There's a lot of people doing some fantastic work to try and predict what this change in scoring is going to do to fantasy football and how you should be drafting, to try and reflect that. And my problem is that I just don't think there's a single player in the NFL that you can be 100% confident is going to be the returner. I think you're going to see a lot of starting players ending up being the returners for their teams, in which case we're just drafting the right players in the right moments. Alvin Kamara and Tyreek Hill are just going to score even more points. And I think when you then overdraft a player later down the board, and I think Rashid Shaheed is a perfect example of this. Rashid Shaheed was a really good returner last year. He was also the wide receiver 3 on the team because Michael Thomas was there. Michael Thomas isn't there anymore. Rashid Shaheed is now the wide receiver 2 on the team. If the change to the kickoffs don't have as much of an impact as we think they will on scoring, teams aren't going to start sticking their wide receiver 2 out there. So my attitude with it was that we had to get through 10 rounds on Friday night, and I think we actually did 12. And my attitude was, I'm not going to draft with returners in mind on Friday night. I'm going to draft with a scoring in mind in terms of, the tight end premium and the rushing bonuses. I'm going to draft a good team. And then when I'm back and it goes into a slow draft, now I'm going to start thinking about taking shots on returners, because I'm quite happy in the later rounds, like you're just trying to shoot for upside. But the sunk cost of trying to draft, I'll have a look at where Rashid Shaheed went in our league. It was a 602, right? So 3 picks after Rashid Shaheed goes, I take Cooper Kupp. Marvin Mims then goes in the 8th, right? Around the same time that I took Stephon Diggs. So the scoring has to be, they have to be the returners, but then the scoring has to be really favorable for them to outperform the players that I took in those ranges. The opportunity that I'm losing by then taking, so the first person that I took with return in mind was Antonio Gibson in the 14th, and then I'll be looking at Dylan Laub in the 19th, Boston Scott in the 20th, Bucky Irving in the 17th, Tez Walker in the 18th. Like even Malachi Corley in the 16th could have some return value. Aside, probably Gibson is the returner there, but you have to see. The opportunity I'm losing in the 14th, 19th, and 20th is nothing like the opportunity I'm losing in the 6th and the 8th. And I just don't think that I am smart enough, and I don't think we as a community are smart enough to accurately predict the impact that this scoring change is going to have this year. And even if we are, that we're going to be able to properly call who the right players are. So I'll be keeping a keen eye on waivers for it. I'm really playing through the last rounds to try and nail some of those returners, but I'm not willing to sacrifice a 6th round pick to try and take a punt on it.
Yeah, I actually totally agree with you, Lewis, and I think, ultimately, like you say, we just can't predict it. And if you're taking Shaheed in the 6th and he doesn't become the returner, and you've foregone Cooper Kupp, who we know, 1 is talented and 2 is going to have a big role on this offense, then obviously you've just busted your team. And I was listening to Scott Fish actually on JJ Zacharyson earlier today. Actually, it came out last week, and he was basically saying actually he didn't really see it as a draft kind of thing. It was more of a week 1, 2, and 3. Who can you pick up off waivers? Kind of who is going to be the kick and punt returners. And I think potentially as a community we've got a bit too excited about it. Now, of course, I'm sure people will have, drafted the returners on certain teams, and maybe the returners from last year will still be the same on certain teams, and great, maybe you've got good value there. But there will be, players that we haven't even thought of, not even on our radar, that will be the kick and punt returners, for certain weeks in the year. And what I like about your strategy, Lewis, is that actually you've also picked players that potentially could have a role on their offenses, like Irving, Laube, Gibson, all potentially may have some standalone value as RB2s, but also if their RB in front of them goes down, may well develop a larger role on their teams. So you've kind of got potentially dual benefit to them. Whereas if you're drafting like a Cavante Turpin in round 16, who likely will ever catch a ball on the offense, or if he does, it might be one or two. You know, he's not going to have much standalone value other than being the kick or punt returner,
Yeah.
which one may or may not happen, and two, even if it does, if he gets injured, what are you going to do with him? You know, and yeah, of course, you know, the later rounds, of course, you can take more of a punt, but I just think I would prefer to take a punt on guys that may also have some sort of role on the offense anyway, whether that be due to injuries or you know, some sort of standalone value, where even if you're wrong, you could potentially still get something out of them by drafting them.
Yeah, I think I'm just very happy to be proven wrong rather than to end up almost swinging for the fences and being on the wrong side of it. I'm more happy to see people end up winning leagues by taking, you know, Mims, and Mims went in the fifth in one of the drafts near us. Like, if that strategy works out, incredible, like absolutely spectacular, incredibly smart. But I'm so not confident in it that I'm not willing to sacrifice that opportunity. So I'm much happier taking players later on that I'm just completely happy. You know, if I take Boston Scott and he's not the kickoff returner for the Rams, well, I'll drop him. That's fine. If you take Rashid Shaheed in the sixth or Marvin Mims in the fifth and they're not the kickoff returner, you can't drop them. You've wasted a pick. You've wasted a roster spot. And I just don't think we can be 100% confident in who any kickoff returner is going to be.
Yeah, and you know, look, ultimately, it probably doesn't matter in the end anyway. You know, it's 4,000 people. It's a bit of fun, but you know, in our opinions, I think we would rather not use the high draft capital on a guy with the off chance that he could be the kick-off punt returner, or because he was it last year. You know,
Yeah.
Because again, things change. Jerry Judy's gone now from the Denver Broncos. You know, Marvin Mims probably going to have more of a role on the offense. Maybe they don't want to put him, you know, back there, and they're going to put someone else. So, you know, things change literally all of the time. So I agree. If it was set in stone, we know who was who, then of course, you know, we'd be drafting them super high, but it isn't. So I think it's worth, like you say, taking a punt on those guys that may or may not be, but also have some value otherwise. And then seeing where we are in week 1, 2, and 3 when we actually figure out who's going to be kicking, you know, who's going to be returning these things, and can we pick them up on waivers. So actually, I'd like to move on to another question based on the scoring system. So what about positional value, Lewis, generally? Do you have certain positions that you are targeting, or are you just kind of looking for where's the good value, you know, and you're kind of going to draft based around that?
Yeah, so to go through the scoring a little bit, so there's a tight end premium, so there's a 1 point PPR for tight ends. Receiving and rushing first downs both get 0.5 points, which obviously doesn't boost a huge amount if scoring's boosted for everyone. I think sometimes, and this is a more general point, people see weird scoring, or they see scoring being generally higher, and they think it boosts certain positions. Well, if it kind of boosts everyone, then it really doesn't boost anyone. The thing which is a huge boost to me is rushing attempts being worth 0.25 points. So for context, that gives a lot of players sort of an 8 to 10 point floor at the running back position. And that's really how I decided to then, you know, target my team. And I would have liked to go for some of the players that are actually going to be more solid on the ground very early on. But this draft ended up being very different to a lot of the ways that I normally tend to draft my team. So I'm normally very wide receiver heavy early. It's normally the way I like to put things together. I sort of manufacture production from my running backs, but look for those real target hogs, the wide receiver position. This, I didn't go for the same thing. I drafted running backs early. I drafted a tight end early. My first wide receiver wasn't until the 5th round. And then I sort of targeted the position from there with people that I think could be real target hogs. But I'm really devaluing the wide receiver position in this scoring format. You know, I think the CeeDee Lambs, the Tyreek Hills, the Amon Ra's like that. I think they're still going to be as good. But I think definitely I really think running backs are boosted, and rushing quarterbacks as well. It's why I was delighted with the way it worked out for my first pick. And I think you'll remember I actually ran over to tell you how it had worked out at the 105. That I'd spent the entire, last month debating between, is it CeeDee Lamb? Is it, because the consensus was Josh Allen, CMC, Lamar Jackson, Jalen Hurts, and then it was, is it CeeDee Lamb? Is it Patrick Mahomes? Like, he was the consensus pick there, but I didn't really like him in this rushing format. Or is it Anthony Richardson as, the real upside pick? And I was really starting to lean towards Anthony Richardson and actually going, do you know what? I'm going to swing for the fences. I'm going to try and win it. Like, Anthony Richardson has such huge upside. And had planned my entire draft around, okay, that was one of the reasons for the stack chart. Where do I have to take Michael Pittman if I'm taking Anthony Richardson? How do I get another safe quarterback? Or do you try and go with, Jaden Daniels or Daniel Jones as someone for the rushing upside? And then all of that was completely incorrect because Lamar fell to me at the 105, who actually, I think there's a real argument could be the 101 in this format. So I was absolutely delighted. I didn't manage to stack him at all until Tez Walker. Which maybe was something that didn't go the way that I really wanted it to, but things just happened to fall a different way. But yeah, with the way that the scoring has shaken out, I think an early running back strategy is a really, really strong one in a way that I don't think it really is a lot of the time.
Yeah, I think a lot of people have been finding it hard to kind of get into that mindset again. For me personally, actually, the running back value just didn't fall to me in the kind of early rounds. But I ended up getting Joe Mixon and Ramondre in kind of, I think it was like the 7th or 8th or something like that. So I was quite happy with those as my kind of first two, because I think they're going to, well, certainly Joe Mixon for sure is going to have a reliable, I think, quite heavy workload in Houston. So I feel quite confident that he was going to be a reasonable pick for me. Ramondre, yes, we're kind of still a bit unsure totally what his role is going to be with Gibson there, but they paid him this off season, so I think they feel he has a role, and I think potentially, he could maybe not be the full workhorse, but I think he could get quite a lot of work. So I'm quite happy, with that. For me, I actually ended up going quite tight end heavy, so I took Travis Kelce in round 2 and then Kittle in round 4. I wasn't.
George Kittle is your least favorite player as well. So I know that must have been hard for you.
But it just felt amazing value because all of the other elite tight ends had, long gone. So Engram went before him, Pitts went before him. So Engram went as the tight end 7 at the 403. Okay. And then I took Kittle at the 406. And I was just a bit like, he's kind of the last, in my opinion, guy in that elite tight end level. And yes, there's going to be weeks when he's going to flop for me. I know that's going to be the case. But in this scoring format where it's 1.5 points PPR and they get an extra 1 point per first down, when he goes off, he's going to go off and he's going to win me weeks. So I'm kind of, with the really large kind of scoring there, I'm willing to take that. Whereas usually in a standard PPR or, tight end premium league, I'm less keen to take that unless it's a best ball where I can, not have him in my lineup when he's not playing. So yes, he is my least favorite player generally to draft, but this time I was like, no, with this scoring, ultimately if I can make it to the playoffs, he could carry me all the way to the final if he has, the big weeks that we've seen him have, because he'll score an absolute arm and a leg on these boom weeks. So I went for it, which is not like me at all. I'm not a bully tight end person. And even, actually generally this year I've been going a little bit more on these elite tight ends because their cost is falling. I didn't want to take a tight end in round 1 when I could have, the top 3 wide receiver or the top 5, the top 3 running back or the top 5 wide receiver. But now I can get them in the 3rd, 4th, 5th round, then I'm way more willing to take them.
Yeah. what's quite entertaining to me is that your tight end 2 is your least favourite tight end, and my tight end 2 is your favourite tight end because it's Kate Otten.
He's going to win you Scott Fishbowl this year, Lewis. I can feel it.
He's stacked with Baker as well. It started getting to a point that I was like, I need a second tight end. And he was the best one on the board all the way down in the 13th because I took Trey McBride in the 3rd, which I was very happy with. I would have liked Mark Andrews to fall, but wasn't to be. But Trey McBride actually at the 308 behind Evan Ingram at the 307, I was absolutely delighted about. But yeah, I ended up with K. Dot as my tight end too. So I actually thought of you when I put that pick in.
Winning tight end there. I mean, that's it, Lewis. I've already crowned you the champion, having made that selection. So shall we chat a little bit about our teams? I guess my first question to you, Lewis, is what has been your favourite selection so far? Give us a bit of a rundown. Who do you like?
Yeah, so I'll talk you through sort of the first 12 rounds or so, because that's when it starts getting a little bit, you start getting into returners and K. Dotton. So my team,
favourite pick, no?
It's not my favourite pick. So my team, I took Lamar Jackson in the 1st, Jahmyr Gibbs in the 2nd, then Trey McBride, Devon Achane, Mike Evans and Cooper Kupp, Baker in the 7th to stack with Mike Evans, Stephon Diggs in the 8th, as I said, who fell, Tony Pollard in the 9th, Jaylen Warren in the 10th, and Russell Wilson as my QB3 in the 11th. I then took Brian Thomas in the 12th as well as my wide receiver 4. So there's a couple of little stacks there with Russell Wilson and Jaylen Warren, and then Baker Mayfield with Mike Evans, and obviously K. Dotton later on as well. In terms of like my favorite pick, and obviously you'll notice these are the ones that I've touched on already. Lamar getting to the 105 was a huge thing for me. Like I was so ready to start looking towards Anthony Richardson, but actually that worked out perfectly. I really like Trey McBride making it all the way to the 308 for me. Like I've seen him go, towards the back end of the 2nd, and there were, he was a tight end 5, and I definitely consider taking him much earlier than that. Achane was the one to me that actually I really wasn't confident in it. It wasn't something I'd really considered beforehand, but Achane went after Rashad White, after Isaiah Pacheco, after Travis Etienne. It was all the way at the 405, and you've heard me speak before about his upside. And it definitely was quite happy taking him there. To be honest, I'm quite happy with how it went all the way through those first sort of 11 and 12 rounds. Obviously, my wide receiver core is quite old, but wide receiver is a little bit devalued here, so they're all going to get a lot of targets. But it's just the way that it worked out with, forcing running back early and then sort of just building on wide receiver with the value that fell. Obviously, I like having Cooper Kupp on the team. I did debate a few others around the same time, but I just couldn't look past him. But Cooper Kupp went after Rashid Shaheed. So, maybe I should have looked to Nico Collins a little bit afterwards, but I if I'm going to win the tournament, I'd rather do it with my guy on the team.
You need at least one Ram in there, don't you, Lewis? I mean, it's just not a team if there isn't some sort of LA Rams presence on there.
Yeah, and I debated just taking Puka at the 208 where I took Jahmyr Gibbs, but I was like, he's not going to make it back, and I do want him, but I was like, this is just such a homer pick. Like, it's not even a good one. I can't even claim that that's a good player at that spot. So actually, no, he ended up going a few spots before me in the 3rd, which was fine.
Way too sensible, Lewis. Way too sensible.
Yeah, strangely so, because I was wearing his jersey as well. Who were your favourites on your team?
So, to be honest, Lewis, I'm not a massive fan of my team. When you just, I don't know, it's just one of those where I'm just like, I'm not wholly happy. So I'm drafting it in the 6th spot. So in round 1, I took Patrick Mahomes. Now, I'm regretting it a little bit because Anthony Richardson was still there. So it went CMC, Josh Allen, Jalen Hurts, Lamar, CD. And I was like, well, Richardson, he ultimately could end up as the QB1, right?
Yeah.
But also, I haven't seen it. He played 2 full games, and yes, he scored fantastically. But then he got injured in the other 2 games that he played, and he hasn't played since. And he played very little in college. So, what actually, if it ends up being that he turns into a bit of a Deshaun Watson in that, he hasn't played that much for so long that ultimately he doesn't quite do what we want, or he gets injured again. So I was like, I'm going to take the reliability of Patrick Mahomes. Now, that probably is the wrong thing to do in this scoring setting. So I'm a little bit regretting doing it, but hey, I've done it now. And at least I know that, at 6 points per touchdown, I know Patrick Mahomes is going to throw a lot of touchdowns. And occasionally, as we get later in the season, he does do a little bit of running. So he might give me the odd rushing point.
And it's a safer pick, and because you ended up stacking him with Kelsey, that value then pays off. Because it ended up that you managed to stack him with his number one receiver, I think I'd be much happier with that, having those two, because of the way it then shook out.
Yeah, so ultimately I was, like you say, lucky in the second round. I took Travis Kelce. I actually took him as the second tight end.
Yep.
So Trey McBride went first.
Wow.
But Laporta was still on the board. But ultimately, I just felt because I had Mahomes, Kelce had the better value for me. So I took Kelce over Laporta, so to get that stack. My slight concern with Kelce is that they might limit his work in season, and they kind of ramp him up for the playoffs, and that's what makes me nervous about him. But I've taken him now. Let's just hope he is busy and helps me out. In the third round, I took Garrett Wilson. And to be honest, I just felt he was the best value. Derrick Henry had gone before me, and really the running backs were like Etienne, Kyron Williams.
Yeah.
And yes, they were options, but I thought they both had their flaws. And I felt that Garrett Wilson, ultimately had the upside to be the overall wide receiver one this year. And I thought getting him in the third round, I think, was good value. So I went with that. In the fourth, I went with George Kittle, as we discussed. And in the fifth, I actually stacked him not with his QB, but with another San Francisco pass catcher, Brandon Ayuk.
Nice.
Now, so far in 5 rounds, I've gone quite heavy on KC and San Fran.
Yeah.
And I feel a little bit nervous about that, because we know that often some teams that have been in Super Bowl the year before do have that kind of slump. But I feel confident in their play callers that they're going to be high-powered offenses going forward. Now, I think, again, ultimately, Ayuk and Kittle may have weeks where one does really well, one doesn't. But I'm hoping like the rest of my team can kind of mask that. And basically, I have boom weeks where, great, I get loads of points, and maybe I have a few losses as we go, and ultimately it balances out and I manage to scrape in at the bottom. Then I went Joe Mixon in the 6th, Ramondre in the 7th, and I was quite happy with those as my first 2 running backs. I went Aaron Rodgers in the 8th as my second QB, and obviously he's then stacked up with Garrett Wilson. So if Garrett goes off, hopefully so will Rodgers.
And I remember helping you make that pick on the night.
Absolutely. And do you know what? I could have waited another round, but hey, no one needs to know that. No more. To be honest, we've been very quarterback light these kind of later rounds. So we're actually in the 12th now, and we've still got Gino on the board. We've still got Daniel Jones on the board. We've got JJ McCarthy, Bo Nix. Who else is there? Derek Carr. There's quite a lot.
So Gino went in the 9th for us.
Yeah. So Bryce Young's just gone at the 12:04. So I'm wondering whether we're going to get more going, because one guy, Higgledy-Piggledy, he's only got 1 QB. The rest of us have got 2 now.
Yeah.
But I think QB3s might start coming off the board soon. But anyway, Aaron Rodgers there in the 8th. In the 9th, I went Marquise Brown.
Yeah.
Again, that's that Kansas City bet. Xavier Worthy was still on the board, but I just, in my opinion, and so was Rashee Rice, actually. And obviously, Rashee, he is lower for me at the minute just because of this possible suspension. But I just felt like if I took Xavier Worthy over Hollywood Brown, it would be because I felt that Xavier Worthy was going to have, well, it would be because of the returning potential. But I don't know he's even going to be the returner. No. So if I think that Hollywood Brown is going to be, the wide receiver 1 effectively on this offense, at least until Rashee comes back, why am I going to take Xavier Worthy on a bet that I'm not even sure is correct. So that's why I went Marquise Brown over Xavier Worthy, rightly or wrongly.
I quite like Hollywood there. I've been taking quite a lot of Hollywood this off season. Just because it might take Xavier Worthy a bit of time to get going. And Rashid Rice, I definitely struggle with, even though he does end up being a good value. In our draft, all three of them went in the 10th. So it was Worthy at the 10:01, Hollywood at the 10:07, and Rice at the 10:10. So I think it's just kind of showing that same thing, that no one really knows which of them to take. I do think, and this fits into something that we've said a lot, especially me and Paul said, like, I'll just take the last one. I'll just take whichever one goes latest. But if I had to place my bets on anyone, it probably would be Hollywood. So especially stacking him with Mahomes as well. One of the only players that I'd be willing to have that mega stack on. So I'd be quite happy with that value where you took him as well.
Yeah, I'm done now with Kansas City. You'll be pleased to know. Okay. Everyone's gone now, to be honest. So that's me done. Then in the 10th, I took D-Hop. And I wasn't sure, here, but I did feel like he was actually quite good value. I know he's getting older, but I do think that people are sleeping on this Tennessee offense. And yes, I know there's question marks about Will Levis, but I do think that Brian Callahan is going to do a good job here. And I'm not overly confident in Calvin Ridley. And I think D-Hop could be the wide receiver one here. And if that offense does go off, then I've got a good value. I know he's old, I get it, but I do still think he's a good player.
He finishes the wide receiver 22 last season. So if you're taking him all the way down the 10th and he's able to repeat the same thing, I was actually listening to a podcast earlier today. I think it was an Underdog talking about that Will Levis as a QB sleeper, and basically saying that, like, in terms of neutral pass rate, they're going to be really high, but also they're probably going to be behind a lot because that defense is pretty terrible. So actually, you're going to get a lot of garbage time points from them. And Will Levis is just going to keep pushing the ball downfield, and that's more likely to be to DeAndre Hopkins. So yeah, I quite like the value there, especially as, like, a wide receiver you're not going to be relying upon to sort of anchor your team every week like we used to with Nuke a few seasons ago.
Yeah, exactly. Ultimately he's my wide receiver 4. So, and then I've gone wide receiver again in the 11th, and I've gone Curtis Samuel. I did look at some of the running backs available, but so when I took D-Hop, I think probably what I should have done was taken a running back, because then we had a run of 6 running backs like Tony Pollard, Javonte, Chubb, I'm not that keen on, but Singletary, Gus Edwards, Brian Robinson. At that time, I was like, oh, there's quite a few running backs still there that I'm happy with. So I'll push it, and I shouldn't have pushed it. So ultimately, I'm a bit behind on running back now. But I took Curtis Samuel in the 11th because all those running backs had gone, and there wasn't anyone that I overly liked. But there's a few now coming up. So I'm 2 away in the 12th, and I'm looking at people like Charbonnet, Rico Dowdle. So I'm happy to take those as, in the 12th. I think they're going to be reasonable values and may or may not, give us some reasonable points. So that's me so far. Now, that was a long-winded way of discussing my team, but on the whole, when I look at it, I'm not like, oh, I'm in love, but I think they've got a chance.
Yeah, I do feel, and we've kind of covered best and worst by just going over our teams as a whole, but I had a really interesting chat with Rich Cooling on the walk back to the station Friday night about sort of how you feel about your team after the draft. And he was saying that actually, normally, if you feel really good about your team after the draft, that just means that you followed ADP. And it means that you've just followed, the consensus of what you were supposed to do there. If you feel a little bit unconfident about your team, that probably means you've swung to the fences and done something a little bit different. And at the end of the day, the consensus very rarely wins in fantasy. Like, we don't tend to predict it exactly. So actually, and it's a slightly backwards way of thinking about it, I'd actually feel slightly better if I don't come away hugely confident, because normally it's when you come away hugely confident that things don't end up going. Like, basically, if you come away feeling hugely confident, what you've done is you've drafted the best team for the previous season. Whereas actually, if you come away feeling slightly less confident, you might have a chance of drafting the best one for the season ahead.
Yeah, I think for mine, it's one of those where I'm a bit like, oh, there's a lot of, as we discussed at the weekend in the Dynasty panel, what ifs. If Kelsey is on the field, then he's going to do well. if Marquise Brown is the wide receiver 1, he's going to do well. If D-Hop is the wide receiver 1 and Will Levis is good, he could outperform his ADP. There's quite a lot of what ifs there. If Aaron Rodgers is healthy, Garrett Wilson and Aaron Rodgers could go off. And all of those, if one of those things kind of falls apart, then probably my team falls apart. But if all of those things hit, which they could do, then I could quite happily and easily be in the playoffs,
Yeah.
So I think because there's a lot of what ifs, it makes me feel less confident. But you never know how your season's going to play out,
Yeah.
and all of these things might hit. And Kelsey was injured last year, and now he's healthy. Maybe they are going to put him on the field, more, particularly if they've got Xavier Worthy, who's rookie, Rushy Rice suspended, and Hollywood Brown's new to the offense, and it can be quite complex. So there's loads of different scenarios where actually all of these things could hit and I could be in the playoffs. But because there's so many what ifs, I feel a bit unsure. But we never know, do we?
Yeah, exactly. Swing for the fences, try out for those what ifs. It's a big old tournament. We're probably not going to win it anyway. So let's see what happens.
And we can't finish any lower than Paul last year. So there's nothing to worry about.
Exactly.
So before we finish, Lewis, I've got one more question for you. Obviously, some people, like me, I'm only in the 12th at the minute, and those that are doing slow drafts might not have finished their drafts yet. So who are your favourite late round targets, and whom would you kind of recommend people might start kind of keeping an eye on as we get through to those final rounds?
Yeah, so I think, so I have sort of a theoretical answer and then one very specific one. So we discussed earlier about sort of looking at returners later on. So I think looking through some very smart people across Twitter talking about players like Dylan Laube, Boston Scott, who obviously I got both of, Greg Dortch is an option, Kene Nwangwu is an option, Kavonte Turpin, Devin Duvernay, Braxton Berrios, like those players that are projected for returners. That's the time when you start looking for them. The player who I've taken all the time at the minute in the very last round and who I am really, really targeting this offseason is Juju Smith-Schuster. And
I'm very surprised.
Yeah, he is currently going undrafted. Is his ADP currently? So his ADP on Sleeper is the 308. So he's not being drafted in a 22 round draft. Juju was obviously paid a lot of money a few years ago. When he went to New England, we thought he'd be the wide receiver 1. It hasn't worked out that way, but they've got a new quarterback coming in. They have such an uncertain depth chart at wide receiver. They obviously drafted 2 rookies. They've still got Kendrick Bourne on the roster. They've got Demario Douglas. Juju is the highest upside of any of them, and we've seen him perform before. If I can take him, as the last pick, I'm actually going to do it in every single draft. I don't think there's any other player in that range that has the same upside to actually be the very last pick of your draft, and actually end up being the wide receiver 1 on their team.
And to be fair, in round 22 or whatever, what have we got to lose? If he's not, then you drop him and you pick up a kick returner, punt returner, and happy days, or a kicker or whatever. Why not? Like you say, there's a lot of uncertainty there. 2 new rookies. Someone's got to catch the ball, and maybe Juju suddenly comes back to life. You literally never know. I am liking these backup running backs that potentially have a chance of special teams. So we've spoken about a lot of them, but someone like a Tyrone Tracy, I like him anyway this season because I think, Singletary's fine, but he's, a plodder. He's not a pass catcher. Barkley's gone now, who was kind of this dual threat. So they may potentially, I know that Daniel Jones does some rushing, but I still think Tyrone Tracy has a role being a bit of a pass catcher and sounds like he's quite explosive. So they may also want to use him on special teams.
Yeah.
So I really quite like him as a target. And, in the area that he's going in ADP and Scott Fish Bowl, I would be happy to take a punt, on him there. Dameon Pierce, generally, I'm not that keen on. But, if Mixon goes down, I probably wouldn't take him on my team. So I've got Mixon, but I hadn't had Mixon. If he goes down, he's likely going to get the work, even though they're not keen on him. And maybe he does a bit of kick or punt return, work there as well. So these backup running backs where, yes, they may well be a kick or punt returner, but they've also got contingent upside for when, the starter goes down. So last season I drafted Zach Moss like in the very last round.
Yeah.
And, you know, we know what happened there. JT went on PUP, you know, and he was like he basically won me like 5 weeks in a row or something because of all the work that he got, and he was great. So for me, in the later rounds, it's these backup running backs that may have special team upside that I think you should be targeting, because one, the scoring, you know, if they get work, the scoring is beneficial to them, and two, you know, if they get kick or punt return work, then they're great. You know, wide receivers are fine, but ultimately, unless they're kick or punt returners, they're probably not going to get, you know, that much work, even if the guys ahead of them go down, because ultimately the ball just gets spread out wider.
Exactly. And I don't want to finish the show without just giving a huge thank you to you for all of the work that you put in this weekend. And a huge thank you to everyone for their support for the panel, and, you know, for everyone being so friendly this weekend. But I think it wouldn't be right to close off without saying a thank you to you from everyone for all the hard work that you put in organising the third UK FFC, too many Fs, and really excited to come next year, and really excited to see where it grows. But absolutely none of it would have happened without you. So very grateful to you for that.
Thank you, Lewis. But, you know, really this wouldn't be the event that it was without everyone that comes, and obviously the amazing panelists like you and Mags, who did an absolutely fantastic job on the Dynasty panel. And I hope if anyone was there, they came to that and got some awesome advice from you both, you know, and really we're just there to try and connect the community, so the community needs to come. And thankfully the last three years the community's been amazingly supportive, and, you know, this event wouldn't be what it is without, you know, everybody who's contributed so far, whether that be attending, you know, being on one of the panels, or, you know, helping behind the scenes or whatever. So really grateful to everyone, and, you know, it's amazing to meet everyone and have such a great time, even though sometimes it's stressful beforehand, but we pulled it off, which was great, and thank you to everyone for coming. Lewis, I think we'll finish it there. Hopefully people have picked up some useful advice about Scott Fish Bowl if they've not finished yet, and can also think about our teams and roasters on the terrible picks that certainly I've made anyway. So obviously we'll be back next week, Lewis. It's been awesome to catch up with you. We may or may not see Paul. Let's see if he can be bothered to turn up, you know. But otherwise we will, well, I'll be back, hopefully you'll be back. Fab. So we'll be here. Let's see if Paul can be bothered to turn up. I mean, he's not much of a loss anyway, is he? Saying in between times, obviously you can catch us on X at Wildcard Rewind, or head over to our YouTube channel and search for the Fantasy Wildcard podcast network, and make sure you give us a subscribe. Otherwise, see you next week.